Video for a little while now, but it seems like it's the perfect opportunity to put this out there for you guys. So I'm going to have this replay going in the background. It's going to be me playing Drift Gaming from a few formats back. I'm on Tri Brigade DP and he's on Pendulum. And I'll just have this going for you guys so you have something to watch while I talk. And I'm going to be talking about how to have like a competitive mindset in Yu-Gi-Oh! And also how to have just kind of a healthy mindset approaching the game as well. I've seen so much drama starting the game. I've seen way too many grown men cry at locals after losing a game. And I just wanted to share my thoughts on how to really, have the correct mindset to compete competitively at a high level, at regionals, at case tournaments, but how to also keep things in perspective and just, maintain your mental health and enjoy the game. And I think a lot of people just develop a pretty negative and jaded attitude about the game for whatever reason. Maybe they don't like a ban list. Maybe they don't like a certain strategy or card that's in the format. And, another negative attitude I see about the game is people who are convinced that it's just 100% luck. And, the only reason you beat them is because you're lucky. And the only reason, of course, when they win, it's all skill. But when they lose, it's just because you're lucky. And, they will make poor siding decisions, they'll make poor plays, and they'll build their deck poorly, and they'll make all these poor decisions along the way and fail to prepare or fail to test their deck at all. And then they'll just call you lucky when you're winning locals every week, and they're not. And, one of the biggest things you can do to gain an advantage in the game is siding. And this is one of your best opportunities to apply your game knowledge and get an advantage for it. Not only in preparing the cards that are going to be in your side deck, but in siding intelligently and knowing what cards to take out and what cards to put in, and really understanding what's making your deck tick and how not to mess up the ratios of your deck. And that's one thing you're not going to get when you're net decking. Not that there's anything wrong with net decking, but no one's going to tell you what cards to put in or what cards to take out during siding. And that's why it's really important to understand deck building. Is even if you're getting your deck online, you're essentially building a deck 2 times every match after siding. And you really need to understand what's going in, what's going out. I've seen so many people just make such poor decisions in siding, and it just shows their lack of game knowledge. At the YCS, that second place Eldritch player, who there's a lot of controversy surrounding, in one of his feature matches, he left in Tikaboo against Prank Kids, and he was playing Eldritch. So you're going to leave a floodgate in your deck that hurts you more than your opponent after siding. I mean, that just shows just that lack of game knowledge, and just shows, that's advantage you're giving your opponent that you don't have to. And so siding is really important in understanding how your opponent's deck works, what cards are good against them, and so on and so forth. So another really important thing is you want to know rulings. You really need to understand rulings, not just so you don't get cheated or screwed over, but because it's going to affect your decision making in chains. You're on chain link 3, you're deciding to activate that chain link 4 effect or not, and you don't know how it's going to resolve. That can be a really tough spot to be in. You really want to know in advance how the game works in a really deep level. For example, a lot of people think that Forbidden Droplets makes Grenmaji's attack 0, when in reality it actually just halves his attack and then negates his effect. Yeah, but the effect of Forbidden Droplets is giving Grenmaji half of what his attack was. So I've been in so many judge calls where they think that Forbidden Droplets will make Grenmaji's attack 0, when in reality it just halves his attack. And there's so many rulings like that are pretty specific to your deck, and you don't need to know every ruling in the game. As long as you know all the rulings for your specific deck and how that interacts with the other decks in the format, you'll be okay. But it's really important that you understand rulings in order to perform as well as you can. And there's little tiny details in the game that they don't matter until they do matter. And what I mean by that is, one of the mechanics of the game is that cards don't leave the field until a chain has resolved. So, we're looking at the screen right now. So Cosmic Cyclone only goes to grave once the chain is resolved. If they were to chain another card, Cosmic would still be on the field when that card resolved. And that becomes important. A lot of times that doesn't matter. So people are pretty fast and loose about that. They'll just kind of send cards to the grave whenever. But it matters a lot in certain situations. Like you have cards like Forbidden Droplet, where suddenly the cards in the field become resources. or cards that have to destroy cards on the field to resolve. Chimera being one of those cards where it has to destroy the same number on the field in order to resolve. Things like that where, okay, how many cards are on the field becomes a question of whether or not a card resolves. That becomes really important. Most of the times it doesn't matter. And that's why keeping track of the game state and communicating with your opponent is really, really important, because if you're not communicating and it's not clear to both players what's going on, what's actually chain link 1, what's chain link 2, if that's not communicated, let's say they chain block an effect, but they're not clear of what effect is chain link 1 and what effect is chain link 2, and you ash blossom that effect, and they're like, oh, actually I ashed it. Like, okay, you didn't declare which was chain link 1 and chain link 2. So it kind of becomes ambiguous, and now private knowledge is revealed, and it just becomes a big mess. And a lot of times that doesn't matter, in these situations, but suddenly it does matter. And because you've been playing fast and loose when it quote unquote didn't matter, now you've got this weird ruling situation where private knowledge has been revealed and the game state is just in a really awkward place. So you really have to communicate clearly. And, I get accused at locals a lot for being really nitpicky, but hey, if you summon the token with Mo Yi, please actually summon the token. Don't just pretend to summon it and then summon Chixao. Let's go through this step by step. You can't just go to the end of your combo in 1 second and just pretend you did all the little steps. There's steps along the way. And in Yu-Gi-Oh, this is really important because it's such a fast card game that a single chain is really equivalent to what a single turn would be in another card game. So you have to really break it down to these single individual chains, and really both players need to understand exactly what's happening and exactly when, so they have the opportunity to use their cards. And there's no effects that are just kind of, oh, you should have assumed that I was using that, so I'm just going to resolve it. You really have to, it's really important that you make it clear what you're doing. You declare effects. You have to declare the graveyard effect of DP, for example. You can't just, oh, well, obviously I was going to use it. Okay, it's obvious you should have, but you didn't. So no, you can't summon it. So it's just really important that you communicate and understand the specific mechanics of the game, like cards going to the grave at the end of the chain. And also something that's really important to do so you cannot get into these sticky situations. You shouldn't resolve a chain until you know for certain both players aren't going to add to that chain. So let's say you set 5 pass and then your opponent activates Lightning Storm and you go, oh, darn it. And you just put all your cards in the graveyard and they go, oh, chain link 2, I'm going to activate this as well. And you go, oh, wait a second. So my traps that are all in the graveyard are actually still in the field and I could use them to respond to this. But this is awkward because now my opponent knows what those 5 cards are. And now they're gaining advantage because of this card that's being activated as chain link 3. And so all this private knowledge has now been revealed because you resolved the chain before both players agreed that there wasn't going to be a chain link 3. So it's really important that you just communicate, and both players understand the game state at all times, and you don't jump the gun on resolving effects before the chain is resolving. The next thing I want to talk about is sharking versus misplaying. And it's so common that your opponent will make a blatant misplay and then try to accuse you of being a shark when you won't let them fix the misplay. And it's super common. And, sharking is a very serious problem. I'll talk about that next. But, you should never, the second you call me a shark because you misplayed, that's just so stupid. It's your fault. You made a mistake. Don't try to make this about me because you made a mistake. Now, sharking is obviously a very big problem as well. Trying to, let's say, for example, oh, I know summon Rabina, I chain Advent of Adventure, and I put Advent of Adventure in the graveyard before I summon off of the Rabina. My opponent could be like, oh, you put the Advent in grave, so that means the chain resolved, which means you can't summon for Rabina because you resolved the chain without summoning. And stuff like that, it's okay, that's 100% sharking. They're not interacting with you, that's sharking. Now, if they're like, oh, I'm going to resolve an effect that I didn't declare or wasn't apparent to both players was being activated, or, I'm going to declare these effects in no particular order and just kind of resolve them however I want and just pretend there's no rules in the game, it just gets messy. And that's where, it's a communication error and things can get just messy. But so obviously sharking is bad. Accusing your opponent of being a shark because you misplay is even worse. So the next thing I want to talk about is cheating. So like, there should be no reason you're ever cheating, but you should never assume your opponent isn't trying to cheat. Um, you should never let your opponent cheat. I don't care how well you know them. You should always just be keeping an eye out for, don't give them an opportunity to cheat if it can be avoided. And there's lots of really subtle things you might not know about. Like one time at a locals, I had someone, just do some suspicious shuffling of my deck. I didn't say, and here's the thing, this is going to happen. You're going to have someone try to cheat you locals. What do you do about it? Do you scream and yell at them and like try to get them banned from the game store? If it's a like repetitive problem, maybe how do you address the issue? And what I find is best is just one-on-one talking to them and saying, hey man, I noticed you did that. Like that's not going to fly. Don't do that again. And I've had that situation happen a couple of times, and that's how I've addressed it. I've just kept it between me and them, and that's fixed the problem. I'm able to just enjoy the game, and you're going to play the same people at locals, and I'm able to play the game and enjoy it with them, even though, maybe they got a little greedy and tried to sneak something past me in the past. But you really will have to develop relationships with the people at locals. You can't piss off everybody at locals and expect to go there and have a good time. That's just not going to happen. And the next thing I want to talk about is like, the game isn't over until it's over. I see a lot of people, scooping way too early, or what do they do? Like they draw their hand and like, oh, this hand is terrible. Or they show it to the guy next to them. Like, look at this hand. And what are you doing when you do that is you're revealing info to your opponent. Maybe you're bluffing them. Maybe you're trying to mind game them, and that's all good fun, but you're revealing info to your opponent. And there really is a really strong poker element to the game. And you don't want to reveal info to your opponent that they don't already have. So it's just not wise to like react at all. You want to have your poker face when you're playing, right? And okay, so what I see people do is like they see a hand and, oh, I can't combo off with this hand, so that means it's a brick. That means this is terrible. And then I look at their hand and it's like, okay, you have 3 hand traps and a really strong trap you can set on the field. So you have 4 points of interaction. You have 4 points, like 4 negates potentially, and you're saying you have a bad hand. Like you're most likely going to completely shut down your opponent. Maybe you can't go full combo, but you're really going to like scoop early because you couldn't full combo when you had the ability to potentially stop your opponent. And for all you know, their hand is even worse than yours. So you may as well at least give them a draw or two. And of course, time is a factor. You don't want to make the game go any longer than it needs to. And maybe you have to just accept that this one isn't going to go your way and you want to go to game 2 or game 3. But you really shouldn't, I've seen so many people just scoop way too early, or just, turn their brain off because they don't have a good hand, and just stop thinking of how they can leverage it to their advantage despite not having the best hand possible. And another really important thing that separates, I think, some of the higher level players from maybe less experienced players is just seeing lines that people don't see. And you have your standard combo videos on YouTube and you'll play your deck, but really understanding how the game works and your deck works really opens up doors to do some really fun lines that you wouldn't necessarily see commonly. There's situations that come up rarely that you need to be able to recognize and respond to, that there's no, set answer. You've never seen it before. And that's something I love about the game, is those puzzles that come up. And an example of this, Mystic Mine is a deck no one likes, right? I actually really enjoy matchups against Mystic Mine because it's really a different game. And there's really funny ways you can out Mystic Mine you might not think of. And I see a lot of people, they'll just like, okay, I scoop against Mystic Mine. I don't play Harpies or Cosmic, so there's no way I'll win. Let's go game 2. But you might have outs to Mystic Mine you may not think of as outs. For example, Solemn Strike is all you need to out Mystic Mine. And I'll give you a few seconds to try to think of how you can out Mystic Mine with Solemn Strike. The answer is you can summon a link monster to your field using all the monsters on your field, a link 2, 3, or whatever you need to do to get to 1 monster, and then Solemn Strike your own summon and negate the summon of your own monster to clear your own field. So that's just an example of like a creative line that you normally would never do, but it's something you can do to out Mystic Mine. So that's a fun example, but you need to be able to see these creative lines that aren't necessarily obvious, or, the idea of solomoning your own monster is hardly ever optimal, but, with the cards you have in hand, that might become the optimal play, and you have to be able to recognize that. And, being able to handle these random situations with is really important, and being able to see those lines and being brave enough to try things that you haven't tried before is really important. So I want to talk about a few things about deck building next, and a few kind of pitfalls you can fall into. And one of those things is a rarity bias, I like to call it. So maybe you're going through your cards and you see that ultimate rare Nibiru and you're like, man, that looks so good, I'm going to put that in my deck. And you're thinking more about, I want to have this blinged out cool deck, and you're not thinking about what the format is and what's optimal. So I do most of my deck building online for that reason, just because you're not looking at a stack of cards, you're not biased by what cards are on top of the pile, et cetera, et cetera. You're really able to think critically about the game overall, and you're not limited by what cards you own necessarily. And you can think about, okay, what cards do I really need? Is buying that $5 card really going to make enough of a difference to justify it? Or are you caught buying $120 high rarity cards just for the kick of it that you don't end up playing? So I think rarity bias, I like to call it, it's something that happens when you kind of get seduced by the, fancy ultimate rare card that you don't necessarily need to be playing. I'll tell you this much, like, I pulled that ultimate rare Dogmatica Ecclesia, and I was like, man, Flowunderease with Dogmatica package looks really good right now, just because I want to put this in my deck. When in reality, I knew that it was the suboptimal build, but it was awfully tempting to try and play that card just because I had that ultimate rare Ecclesia. And another important thing in deck building is just remaining really humble. And I don't know why. I mean, people get super arrogant about Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially when it comes to their lists or certain cards. You're like, well, I don't play this card, so anyone that does is wrong, and I'll fight them to death trying to convince them that they should never play this card. And people get so, like, especially on these Facebook groups online, I mean, it's ridiculous. You try to share an idea that's outside the norm on one of these Yu-Gi-Oh! Facebook groups, and people just absolutely lose their mind. So, I think it's really important to just stay humble in your build and sharing your ideas with other people. But as well, you need to really think critically about the ideas they're suggesting. Maybe at first glance, you go, oh, this guy's list is terrible, but you really want to consider other people's ideas and not write them off immediately, and accept the fact that maybe your deck sucks and maybe you're doing something that's just incorrect, and be open-minded and not get stuck in like a certain way of thinking. You really need to be open-minded to avoid just ending up playing a suboptimal deck. A friend of mine always uses the example when he was playing Salamangreat. He was one of the first ones to play Buffalo and not play what's that little B card or whatever, the level 4 Cyberse, little insect looking thing. Anyway, and everyone was like, oh, that's just so stupid. Why would you ever do that? And lo and behold, like a few months later, everyone is on Flame Buffalo. So I noticed a trend too, that a lot of the really higher level players, like that are just like performing a lot better than everyone else, they're doing something with deck building and in how they play the deck that's just 100% different than everyone else who's playing. And that's a pattern that I've noticed. So don't be afraid to do things differently than what's the quote unquote, accepted optimal norm. And again, I think it's just really important to be obnoxiously clear about the game state when you're playing. What phase is it? What are you chaining? What's chain link 1? What's chain link 2? Are you activating the card? Are you activating the effect as well? And just all sorts of those things. I'm just throwing that out there again because that causes so many problems, and you're going to end up revealing private knowledge you don't need to reveal. And it just causes game state problems. And, a lot of times it doesn't matter. And okay, it doesn't matter if he sends that card to the graveyard before the chain resolves, but you want to be on top of those things before they suddenly matter. Otherwise you're in trouble. And, another big thing that matters in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is resource management and, saving interruptions, knowing when to use them. And there's two extremes to this. There's people that just shotgun all of their negates as soon as they can. And then there's people who, they'll save the negates they have on board for next format. They never use them. I'll watch someone with like a 4 material Zeus on field, and their opponent has like 2 cards on field. I'm like, okay, they have 1 card in hand and 2 on field. You should probably Zeus right now. And then they wait too long, and next thing you know, their opponent pulls something over on them. And so you don't want to save your negates for next format is something I'd say. And, I got a lot more to talk about here. I know our replay ended here. We had the anti-spell against Hand of Full Spells and DPE and everything. But I'm going to go ahead and continue talking for a little bit here. And, I think in Yu-Gi-Oh there's going to be highs and lows, and I think it's really important to know how to win gracefully as well as lose gracefully. And you're going to win and you're going to lose. And when you win, I think you still want to consider like, okay, what could I have done better? What could I have done worse? And I think it's really important to lose gracefully. How many people I've seen, like I said at the beginning of this video, way too many grown men cry after losing a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's just so awkward. Like, I don't want to hear you complain about or insult me like, oh, that's so unfair. You drew those hand traps. Like, okay, you're just going to insult me and pretend that this all happened because of sheer luck. And it's just not fun. Saltiness is part of the game. We all get salty. But I think it's really important to be level-headed. And I was really impressed at something that happened at locals yesterday. I had an opponent, and I 2-0'd him. He's on Sky Striker, and he was just so graceful and is such a good sportsman. Such good sportsmanship. He's like, "Oh, I'm really impressed with how you played the deck," and we were able to just really enjoy the game and sit down and play the game without all that drama attached to it, and just really have a good time. And like, no, I'm not superior at life because I beat you, but it turned out this way this time. It'll certainly could change next time. And it was just a really good time. And it was his attitude, just the way he approached. I was very impressed with him. And it was really great because earlier in the day, I had a matchup where the opponent intentionally forced a draw and was just being super salty and just a complete jerk. And it's like, this is not fun. This is not what I want to do after work. I don't want to. So anyway, that was kind of a good healing moment for me. Was this opponent? He was just a really good sportsman and just really polite and kind, and really talented, and gave me a run for my money. But I was able to, anyway, it was a pretty sacky game, frankly. It wasn't, but anyway, so it's really important to think, look at the big picture, keep things in perspective. Yu-Gi-Oh is an absolutely ridiculous hobby and pursuit to pursue. So just keep things in perspective and keep it fun. And you really want to learn to enjoy the game, even when you're losing. Keep a smile on your face and just be happy that you're able to participate in something as ludicrous as this. If losing the game is upsetting and ruining your whole day, then I think you need to maybe reconsider if this is something you want to be spending your time doing. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. And there's I think a few new subscribers coming in recently, and I really appreciate that. And I hope to provide some positive content for you guys. And for those of you who've already been subscribed, I really appreciate your support. And I think a lot of people are following me for some of my Flunderies content and some of the stuff I've put out there. And I do continue to intend doing that. And there's going to be a lot more in the future. I do think that deck's going to be around a long time. And I am going to be doing a Power of the Elements deck profile for post Power of the Elements deck profile for Flunderies that I'll be sharing with you here shortly. And if you have any thoughts for how I can build that deck and adapt it for Power of the Elements, I'd be happy to hear about them. I don't think a lot needs to change. It has a pretty good matchup against Splight and 2 Elements, especially with Dimension Shifter. So it's not going anywhere for a long time, but I just thought I'd get these thoughts out there for you. And there's just so much that separates the high-level Yu-Gi-Oh players from, and there's nothing wrong with being like a casual player, but those that want to really compete at the high levels, these little details matter. And it's just so important to communicate. And the biggest example I'll give you is Solemn Judgment, right? So if like your opponent summons a monster and they're like, okay, Chain Link 1, Chain Link 2, like, well, actually I'm thinking, are you thinking on the summon or are you thinking on the effect? The correct thing to do is just not answer. Like, I told you I'm thinking, because you don't be like, well, I'm thinking if the summon's going to resolve, because then they're like, oh, okay, he has Solemn Judgment. So you really have to be like always in this mindset and in this way of playing that has you prepared for these situations to prevent them. I've been in so many judge calls that were just completely avoidable if both players communicated and weren't playing fast and loose to try to maybe speed up their combos, et cetera, et cetera. It's just so important to play properly all the time to avoid these ruling disputes and avoid contention with your opponent and avoid irreparable game states that reveal private knowledge and so forth. So anyway, I'm really excited to get this out for you guys, and I hope you enjoyed it.